on AFR Talk.
Welcome back. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, and a lot of disagreement on how to defend the United States, how to defend our country against radical Islamists. And someone who's an expert in that field certainly is the Clarion Project's own Ryan Morrow, founder of worldthreats.com, clarionproject.org. Check it out. Ryan, before we took the break, we addressed Afghanistan and why we need to be there, why we need to take action, why we can't just drone it. And that leads us to a situation in Egypt. First, you said last time it was not a coup. Explain.
It's not a coup, and that's because when I think of a coup, I think of the military taking control of a country, overthrowing a government, and controlling the place themselves. That's not what happened here. Here you had, by some counts, as high as 22 million Egyptians in the streets that asked the military to intervene on their behalf in order to stop the crushing of a democracy by the Muslim Brotherhood. So the military intervened in order to stop that crisis and handed over power to an interim president and has announced just in the past 48 hours, a democratic transition plan for new elections. That's not a coup. A military dictatorship doesn't do that.
Were you surprised to hear that Israel was a supporter of continuing the aid to the military as the military has set this up?
Not at all, and that's because the military right now is the counter to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's true that Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood were able to have the top layer of the military retire and they replace them with Islamists, but the military is a larger entity than that. And so if they're the ones that are countering the Muslim Brotherhood, you do want that aid to continue. And also, just from a PR perspective, right now you have the vast majority of Egyptians do not like the United States, and if we were to cut off aid to the Egyptians after they threw out the Muslim Brotherhood, then they're going to be convinced more than ever that we're on the side of the enemy.
And this is part of the $1.3 billion that we give them. President Obama waived the restrictions that were put on by Congress to get that aid to Morsi, obviously the Muslim Brotherhood, and not really a defender of human rights, to say the least. So now we have the Muslim Brotherhood acting like the Muslim Brotherhood, throwing people off buildings, terrorizing. And my question is, will they step into line in the sense of saying, okay, we'll go through the democratic process. We're going to try to win the hearts and minds. Or are they going to play the intimidation game they did on Election Day back a year ago?
I think the majority of Muslim Brotherhood members that always view democracy just as a way of getting into power are going to say, all right, well, that process didn't work, so then we have to go back to jihad. And so you're going to see the ranks of the radical Salafists, the ones that have been more prone to violence in the past, really grow as members of the Muslim Brotherhood shift over to their camp. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood leadership has said a few contradicting things. On the one hand, they appear to incite violence, and the White House said that it was an explicit call to violence that it condemned. But then the Muslim Brotherhood came out and said, no, we're talking about standing up to the new Egyptian government peacefully and making sure that everyone's out in the streets but not engaging in violence. That may be about to change because today the Egyptian government arrested the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, not Mohammed Morsi, but the leader of the entire organization. And so we'll have to see if they formally declare jihad or not, or maybe they're perfectly happy saying that they're nonviolent, but then giving their followers every reason to engage in violence.
Okay, so what does the White House do? Other than, as you recommended, meet with opposition leaders or political leaders that are forming parties in order to be elected, become part of that process, and to recognize them, what else do they need to do? What does President Obama need to do now?
I think it's time for a new speech to the Arab world. Just like how when he began his presidency, he went to Cairo, and it was shortly before the Arab Spring, and he gave that big speech. I think it's time for another one. And in that, he has to talk about the fall of political Islam. He has to unequivocally ally the United States with the Egyptian people now against the Brotherhood, talk about why they're such a bad force, encourage the reformist interpretations of the religion. And if the Muslim Brotherhood formally declares jihad, then that makes it very easy for us legally to declare them a terrorist organization. And if we do that, then there's going to be worldwide repercussions against the organization, and you're going to see even organizations here in the United States probably shut down.
We seemingly have a problem doing that, looking at terrorist organizations and calling them terrorist organizations. And that may be because there's some intellectual disagreement, or the idea that you can nudge them away from that, and if you do that, you cut them off and they immediately become an enemy. But when they're slaughtering people, like we have a situation in Nigeria that you've talked about, Ryan, and that the Clarion Project is addressing with a terrorist group that is slaughtering Christians, has slaughtered and continues to slaughter Christians, and we won't designate them, the United States will not designate them a terrorist group. What is this group?
Yeah, everyone out there needs to hold on to their seats because they're going to be really outraged at this. There is an al-Qaeda affiliate named Boko Haram that operates in Nigeria. And thanks to this group, Nigeria, especially the north, is the deadliest place on earth for Christians. Now, they're a jihadist organization that is obviously foreign because they're based in Nigeria. They engage in terrorist activity, so obviously they're a foreign terrorist organization. And unlike the Muslim Brotherhood, which can go out there and claim that they participate in elections and do some moderate things and they have a good PR game, there's none of that for Boko Haram. They say what they're going to do, and they just slaughtered a bunch of kids the other day, about 30 of them. They attacked a school. And the United States has not designated it as a foreign terrorist organization. The British just did, but the U.S. still has not. And that's because the Obama administration wants to keep the fight against terrorist groups as narrow as possible and doesn't view this group as a direct threat to the United States. But that's a policy that is completely absent of any morality. And so I encourage all of your listeners to go to clarionproject.org, look for the article about Boko Haram, and you'll see a link in there to sign our petition to try and raise pressure on the White House to really take up this cause and do what's right and designate this group as a foreign terrorist organization.
Ryan, you're on the show a lot, probably certainly in the top 3 of guests, and everybody's tied multiple times a week, and we run out of time because there's so much of this to talk about. But these issues rise up. They're flashpoints, and then everybody wants to know the tip of the iceberg we've seen, what's beyond it, what's underneath, and how did we get here? And they want answers fast. And what's great about the conversation that we're having is the fact that we are hopefully bringing some context and some preparation, because our enemy is not going away, and we must use the power of the bully pulpit to expose them for who they are. And you're doing that. Obviously, the ClarionProject.org is doing that with Boko Haram. Ryan, always appreciate you, man. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Take care. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, AFR Talk. So, do you remember after 9/11, it brings me that idea of saying, well, all of a sudden this was happening. Well, it was happening throughout the 1990s, and certainly in the 80s it happened, in Islamic terrorism. It's not going away. We need to address it. And there are all sorts of arguments and elements to the debate. What really frustrates me is that 18 to 22% of our budget goes to national security. We have 60% plus go to entitlements, and people say, no, we got to cut the military. Let me be clear about Crane Durham's foreign policy. One, there are choices between invade and do nothing, certainly. And if we do put troops in harm's way, we identify a path to victory, we go to it, and we give the generals what they need. President Obama did not do that and has not done that in Afghanistan. So how do we defeat it? We face it, trace it, and erase it. We go right where, thank you, Stuart Smalley. We go right where they are. We get the state sponsors, and that's regime change in Iran. Another conversation altogether. But when I'm speaking about these things, I think it is ridiculous that we don't have a press conference every week on our fronts, multiple fronts in the war on terror. If we have soldiers fighting, there needs to be the president. Bush should have done it, and President Obama should do it every Friday and bring us an update. That is the obligation you have to the men and women who are defending our freedom, the 1% of the nation that has chosen to step up and defend our freedom. And we need that, and we should demand that. R's or D's, not important. Speaking of President Bush, he was interviewed this week on ABC News by Jonathan Karl about why he's focusing in on Africa and cervical cancer. And here is what he said when asked, why Africa? Roll it.
Why Africa? I mean, was there a moment where this clicked for you? I mean, you visited.
There's a moment because I was the president of the most powerful, rich nation, and pandemic was destroying an entire generation, and I thought it would be morally shameful not to act.
So what do you make? I know you're not into psychoanalysis. These are your critics who say that all this Africa work you're doing, that a big part of it is you're trying to make up for mistakes you made in Iraq or elsewhere, and this is.
What
do you say to that?
Let them continue to babble.
Not true.
I'm trying to think of the proper word. Absurd psychobabble.
And that's what we get. But remember, that man was portrayed as the moron, the idiot. And what we're seeing is what he stood for, what he believed in. I don't agree with him on a whole host of issues, but I can respect him. President Obama to Africa, you know what he had to say? Roll it.
Ultimately, if you think about all the youth that everybody's mentioned here in Africa, if everybody's raising living standards to the point where everybody's got a car and everybody's got air conditioning and everybody's got a big house, well, the planet will boil over unless we find new ways of producing energy.
Yeah, that man's genius, right? One believes in freedom for all. One believes that the state should be determining who has what. Yeah, if you want to draw, because history's going to draw a comparison, big time. History's a friend to people who believe and leaders who believe in freedom. Ronald Reagan, for example. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, proudly on AFR Talk.